Amara Justice walked into the courthouse with a quiet determination. The towering marble columns, polished floors, and heavy oak doors whispered of centuries of trials, verdicts, and the pursuit of justice. To an outsider, she might have seemed like just another observer. Her simple attire, a navy blue pantsuit, and a leather notebook clutched in her hands betrayed nothing extraordinary. Yet Amara's very presence carried an air of focus and authority. She wasn't here by chance. The day's trial was significant. The case involved one of the largest corporations in the country, accused of exploiting workers and violating labor laws. The stakes were high not just for the workers who had suffered for years, but for the broader implications of how corporations wielded power unchecked. Amara had followed the case closely, though not publicly. Today was different. She was here to witness firsthand how the justice system would handle such a pivotal moment. What the packed courtroom didn't know, however, was that Amara was far more than a curious observer. She was the daughter of Supreme Court Justice Lionel Justice, one of the most influential legal minds in the country. But Amara never traded on her father's name. She believed in forging her own path and standing on her own merit. Her presence in the courtroom was meant to be silent yet intentional, a way of understanding the system's workings from the inside out. The courtroom was a hive of activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, paralegals whispered hurriedly to one another, and the gallery buzzed with a mix of journalists, activists, and everyday citizens. The defendant's legal team, dressed in sharp, tailored suits, radiated corporate confidence. Their lead attorney, a middle-aged man with a shark-like smile, exuded an aura of untouchability. On the other side, the plaintiffs, a group of blue-collar workers, most of them immigrants, sat quietly, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Amara had seen these faces in news stories and press releases, but seeing them here in person made the stakes feel more visceral. She moved quietly to take her seat near the back of the gallery, carefully choosing a spot that gave her a full view of the proceedings without drawing attention to herself. The room was almost full, and people jostled for seats as the trial was about to begin. Amara noticed a few curious glances her way. It wasn't unusual. Her radiant confidence often caught people's attention, even when she tried to blend in. But she ignored the stares, keeping her eyes on the front of the courtroom. Standing near the courtroom's entrance was Officer Derek Monroe, a bailiff assigned to maintain order in the trial. Monroe was in his mid-40s, with a stocky build and a perpetually sour expression that seemed etched into his face. His uniform, though neat, carried a worn look, much like the man himself. Monroe had been a court officer for over a decade, but his career had plateaued. While other officers climbed ranks or earned recognition for their service, Monroe remained stuck in his position, burdened by disciplinary write-ups and whispers of misconduct. Those whispers, however, never turned into formal consequences, a fact Monroe wore like a badge of bitter pride. Monroe had a history of singling out people he deemed out of place. To him, maintaining order often meant asserting dominance over those he viewed as lesser, particularly people of color. It wasn't something he openly admitted, even to himself, but his actions betrayed a pattern that many in the courthouse had noticed. And today, Monroe's sharp eyes caught sight of Amara Justice. At first, he noticed her for the same reason everyone else did: her composed demeanor, her quiet but commanding presence. But something about her set his teeth on edge. To Monroe, she didn't belong. He couldn't place why, but he didn't need a reason. Years of unchecked biases had trained him to see threats where none existed. As Amara settled into her seat, Monroe made a mental note to keep an eye on her. The trial began, and the lead prosecutor launched into their opening statement. They painted a damning picture of corporate greed, detailing how the company had systematically underpaid workers, forced them into unsafe conditions, and threatened anyone who spoke out. The defense, in contrast, argued that the plaintiffs misunderstood the complexities of corporate operations and were misrepresenting facts for financial gain. The room was tense, every word charged with the weight of the case's implications. But Monroe's attention wasn't on the lawyers or the evidence. It was on Amara. He watched her as she scribbled notes in her leather notebook, her gaze never wavering from the front of the room. He watched how she occasionally glanced at the plaintiffs, her expression one of quiet empathy, and it irritated him. Who was she to look so confident, so self-assured? His frustration grew with every passing moment until it bubbled into a full-blown suspicion. What was her purpose here? Why was she so focused? When a brief recess was called, Monroe decided to act. As people began to stretch and chat quietly, he made his way toward Amara's seat. His boots thudded against the polished floor, each step echoing in the courtroom. Several heads turned as he approached her, but he didn't care. To him, this was his duty, keeping order and ensuring no one overstepped their bounds. "Ma'am," Monroe said, his tone sharp and laced with authority. Amara looked up, her calm eyes meeting his. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked politely, though her voice carried an undertone of curiosity. Monroe took her question as defiance. "You need to explain what you're doing here. This section isn't open to just anyone." Amara blinked, then smiled faintly. "I'm here to observe the trial," she said simply, gesturing to her notebook. "I didn't realize there was an issue." "It is when you're sitting in a section that's not meant for public observers," Monroe snapped, ignoring the fact that the gallery was open seating. "You'll need to move. Now." Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. "I was under the impression that this was a public courtroom, officer." "Monroe," he said curtly, "and I don't care what impression you're under. You're disrupting proceedings." "I assure you I'm not," Amara replied. "But if you feel strongly about it, I'll be happy to clarify my presence here with the court staff." Monroe's face darkened. Her calmness was infuriating. He had expected compliance, maybe even fear. Instead, she met his gaze without a hint of intimidation. To him, this was a challenge, and Monroe didn't back down from challenges. "That won't be necessary," he said coldly. "You'll leave now, or I'll escort you out myself." Amara didn't move. For a moment, the two stared at each other, the room around them fading into silence. Then, Amara spoke, her voice low but firm. "You're making a mistake, Officer Monroe." It was a simple statement, but something about the way she said it sent a ripple of unease through Monroe. He dismissed it as bravado, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "Let's go," he barked. The entire gallery turned to watch as Monroe dragged Amara toward the exit. The murmurs began almost immediately, hushed voices questioning what had just happened. Amara didn't resist, but as she walked, she looked over her shoulder and locked eyes with the lead prosecutor. She said nothing, but the prosecutor's brow furrowed, as if recognizing her. As the heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind them, Monroe felt a twinge of triumph. But in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, what if she was right? What if this really was a mistake? As the heavy courtroom doors slammed shut behind them, Officer Derek Monroe led Amara Justice through the marble-tiled hallway with a grip on her arm that was firmer than necessary. The muffled murmurs from inside the courtroom were now faint echoes, but the tension in the air felt palpable, as though the walls themselves bore witness to what had just transpired. Amara walked alongside Monroe, her calm demeanor unshaken, her head held high despite the officer's obvious attempts to intimidate her. Monroe, however, was simmering with barely contained frustration. He couldn't place it, but something about Amara irked him deeply. It wasn't just her composure, it was the unspoken confidence she exuded, the way she carried herself as though she had nothing to prove. To him, she looked like someone who had gotten away with bending rules for too long, and today he was determined to put an end to it. "You people always think you're above the law," he muttered under his breath, his words dripping with venom. The phrase was quiet, but loud enough for Amara to hear. Amara stopped mid-stride, forcing Monroe to pause as well. She turned her head to face him, her expression calm, but her voice sharp and deliberate. "What exactly do you mean by you people, Officer Monroe?" she asked, tilting her head slightly as if daring him to elaborate. Monroe's jaw clenched, his face reddening. "You know exactly what I mean," he shot back. "You walk in here like you own the place, sitting wherever you want, acting like the rules don't apply to you. Not today." Amara raised an eyebrow, her composure unwavering. "I'm here to observe a public trial, which, to my understanding, is entirely within my rights as a citizen. But it seems you have a different interpretation of the rules." Monroe's grip on her arm tightened. "Don't get smart with me. We'll sort this out with security. Until then, you're out of this building." Before Amara could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Officer Monroe," it was Jason Harper, a younger, nervous-looking security officer who had just rounded the corner. His voice wavered slightly, as though he was trying to summon courage he didn't quite have. "What's going on here?" Monroe turned to face Harper, his expression darkening further. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with," he snapped. "This woman was causing a disturbance in the courtroom. I'm escorting her out." Harper hesitated, his eyes darting between Monroe and Amara. He'd seen enough in his few years at the courthouse to recognize when something wasn't right. "Are you sure about that?" he asked cautiously. "She doesn't seem like someone who'd—" "I said it's under control," Monroe barked, cutting him off. "Go back to your post." Harper took a step back, clearly intimidated, but he didn't leave. Instead, he gave Amara an apologetic glance before retreating a few paces, just far enough to avoid further confrontation. Amara noted the interaction but said nothing, choosing instead to let Monroe dig himself deeper into the hole he was so confidently creating. As Monroe marched her down the hallway, they passed by a small cluster of lawyers huddled near the water cooler. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored grey suit, turned her attention toward the commotion. Her gaze lingered on Amara, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. The lawyer stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tile. "Excuse me, Officer Monroe," she said, her tone firm but polite. "What exactly is going on here?" Monroe didn't stop walking, but he threw a dismissive glance over his shoulder. "None of your concern, counselor. Go back to your business." The lawyer, undeterred, quickened her pace to keep up. "Actually, it is my concern. That's my client's trial you just disrupted. If there's an issue involving courtroom security, I'd like to know about it." Monroe stopped abruptly, spinning around to face her. "This woman doesn't belong here," he said, his voice rising. "She was sitting in a restricted section and refused to cooperate when I asked her to move." Amara finally spoke, her voice calm but cutting. "Restricted section. I wasn't aware that public seating had restrictions based on who you think should be there, Officer Monroe." The lawyer's sharp eyes narrowed as she studied Amara more closely. "Wait a minute," she said slowly. "You're not just an observer, are you?" She turned to Monroe, her tone growing colder. "Officer, do you even know who you're talking to?" Monroe's face hardened. "I don't care who she is," he snapped, Rules are rules. The lawyer opened her mouth to respond, but Amara gently placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "It's fine," Amara said softly, her gaze fixed on Monroe. "Let him continue." The lawyer hesitated but nodded, stepping back reluctantly. Monroe smirked, clearly misreading the interaction as a victory. "That's what I thought," he said, his tone smug. "Let's go." He led Amara toward a side door that opened into a dimly lit corridor, away from the main flow of courthouse traffic. The hallway was quiet, save for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of voices from nearby offices. Monroe stopped in front of an unmarked door and pulled out a keycard, swiping it to unlock the door. "This is where we'll wait," he said curtly, gesturing for her to step inside. Amara didn't move. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest and tilted her head slightly. "And what exactly are we waiting for?" "For someone to come down here and confirm who you are," Monroe replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "Unless, of course, you'd like to save us all some time and admit you're in the wrong." Amara smiled faintly, a hint of steel behind her calm expression. "And what exactly am I supposed to admit to, Officer Monroe? Sitting in a public courtroom, taking notes, or perhaps just existing in a way that offends you?" Monroe's face turned a deep shade of red. He stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You're walking a fine line, lady. Keep pushing me and you'll regret it." Amara met his gaze without flinching. "The only one who's going to regret their actions today is you." At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Both Monroe and Amara turned to see a tall, imposing figure striding toward them. It was Judge Bartlett, the presiding judge of the trial Amara had been observing. His robe billowed behind him as he approached, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "Officer Monroe," Bartlett said sharply, "what is the meaning of this?" Monroe straightened, his demeanor shifting into one of forced professionalism. "Judge Bartlett, this woman was causing a disturbance in the courtroom. I was simply—" "Disturbance?" Bartlett interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "I highly doubt that. Miss Justice, would you care to explain?" Amara took a step forward, her voice steady and composed. "Your Honor, I was observing the trial as a guest when Officer Monroe decided that my presence was unwelcome. He insisted I leave and has been quite insistent ever since." Bartlett's gaze flicked between Amara and Monroe, his expression darkening. "Miss Justice," he repeated slowly, as though the name had finally registered. "You're Lionel Justice's daughter, aren't you?" Monroe froze, the blood draining from his face. "Wait, what?" Amara turned her gaze back to Monroe, her faint smile returning. "I told you, Officer Monroe. You're making a mistake." The hallway was heavy with silence as Judge Bartlett's words hung in the air, reverberating in Monroe's mind. "You're Lionel Justice's daughter, aren't you?" For a moment, Monroe's composure cracked. His mind raced to reconcile what he had just heard with the situation unraveling before him. Amara Justice. The name now felt like a slap to his face. Lionel Justice was not just a Supreme Court justice, he was one of the most respected legal minds in the country, known for his towering intellect and unwavering moral compass. To many, he was the living embodiment of fairness and justice in a system often criticized for its failings. Amara watched as the realization slowly dawned on Monroe, her gaze steady but unyielding. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was sinking in on its own, and she was content to let it weigh on him. Monroe's instinct was to backpedal, but his pride and impulsiveness wouldn't let him. Instead, he doubled down, his voice faltering but still laced with defensive arrogance. I don't care who she is," he stammered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "She was still acting suspiciously, and I was doing my job." Judge Bartlett's piercing gaze turned icy. Your job, Officer Monroe, is to maintain order and uphold the dignity of this courthouse, not to harass and manhandle respected guests without cause. Monroe's jaw tightened. He was cornered, but he wasn't about to admit defeat, not yet. Your Honor, with all due respect, he said, his voice rising slightly. She was sitting in a section of the courtroom reserved for whom? Bartlett snapped, cutting him off. His tone was sharp, authoritative, and brooked no argument. This is a public courtroom, officer. Every citizen has the right to sit and observe these proceedings, regardless of where they come from or who they are. Are you suggesting otherwise? I know, Your Honor. That's not what I meant, Monroe stammered, his face flushing. Then what exactly did you mean? Bartlett pressed, taking a step closer. His towering presence loomed over Monroe, who suddenly seemed smaller and less certain of himself. Because from where I stand, it looks like you've allowed your personal biases to cloud your judgment, a grave error for someone entrusted with maintaining fairness in a court of law. Amara's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Bartlett's words were doing what she had chosen not to do herself, dismantling Monroe's false authority piece by piece. Monroe swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at Amara, his mind scrambling for a way out. If there was a misunderstanding, he began, his tone shifting to one of forced contrition. Then I apologize. I was only trying to ensure security. Enough, Bartlett said sharply, raising a hand to silence him. We'll address your actions later. For now, Miss Justice, you are free to return to the courtroom if you wish. This matter is closed. Amara inclined her head slightly, her voice steady as she replied. Thank you, Your Honor, but I believe I'll remain here for a moment. Bartlett nodded, understanding her unspoken intention. Very well, he said, turning to leave. But before he walked away, he paused and looked over his shoulder at Monroe. Consider this your final warning, officer. If I hear so much as a whisper of further misconduct, I'll personally see to it that you're removed from your position. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Monroe muttered, his voice barely audible. As Bartlett disappeared down the hallway, the silence between Amara and Monroe grew thick. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Monroe shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado now completely drained. He avoided meeting Amara's gaze, but she wasn't about to let him off so easily. You're fortunate, Officer Monroe, she said finally, her tone cool but laced with a quiet authority that rivaled the judge's. Judge Bartlett is far more measured than I would have been in his position. Monroe bristled, his pride still stinging. Look, I already apologized, he said, his voice defensive. What more do you want? Amara tilted her head, studying him. Apologized, she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. I didn't hear an apology, officer. What I heard was an attempt to save face. Monroe's face reddened further, but he didn't respond. Amara took a step closer, her voice dropping to a lower, more deliberate tone. Do you know what the difference is between power and authority, Officer Monroe? She asked. Power is the ability to impose your will on others, whether it's justified or not. Authority, on the other hand, is earned through respect, integrity, and accountability. Today you've demonstrated power, but you've shown no authority, and that's why this will not end well for you. Monroe's lips pressed into a thin line, but he still said nothing. He felt the weight of her words, but his wounded ego refused to let him acknowledge them. Amara let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. You assume that because I didn't resist your manhandling, I'm weak. But you couldn't be more wrong. Strength isn't measured by how loudly someone protests, it's measured by how effectively they dismantle the systems that allow people like you to abuse your positions. And trust me, officer, I've spent my entire life learning how to do just that." Her words hit Monroe like a sledgehammer, but before he could formulate a response, the sound of footsteps interrupted the charged moment. Both of them turned to see Jason Harper, the younger security officer from earlier, approaching hesitantly. "Miss Justice," Harper said, addressing her directly and avoiding Monroe's gaze. "I wanted to apologize for not stepping in earlier. I saw what was happening. But it's all right," Amara said gently, cutting him off. "You're not the one who should be apologizing." Harper nodded, visibly relieved. Then, turning to Monroe, he added, "The court administrator just called for you, officer. They want to see you in their office." Immediately, Monroe stiffened. "What for?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. Harper shrugged, his expression neutral. "Didn't say. Just told me to find you." Monroe glanced at Amara one last time, his expression a mixture of frustration and unease. Without another word, he turned and stalked down the hallway, his boots echoing against the marble floor. As he disappeared around the corner, Harper let out a small sigh. "I really am sorry about all this," he said quietly. "Monroe's, well, he's got a reputation. But people are usually too scared to call him out." Amara studied Harper for a moment, then offered him a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you for speaking up," she said. "It takes courage to stand against injustice, no matter how small the act may seem." Harper looked surprised by her words but nodded gratefully. "If there's anything I can do—" "There is," Amara said, her voice firm. "Make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Your silence enables people like Monroe to thrive. Don't let that silence continue." Harper nodded again, his expression resolute. "I won't." With that, Amara turned and began walking back toward the courtroom. Her strides were purposeful, her composure unshaken. The first battle had been fought, but she knew the war was far from over. And if Officer Monroe thought he could escape accountability, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The heavy silence that lingered in the hallway after Officer Monroe's departure was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy Amara had just endured. But she knew this quiet was temporary, a fragile calm before the storm that had yet to fully break. The echo of Monroe's boots faded, and Amara took a moment to compose herself. She adjusted her notebook in her hand, glanced at her reflection in the glass window beside her, and squared her shoulders. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Amara turned to re-enter the courtroom, another figure emerged from a side corridor. It was Judge Bartlett, his robe flowing behind him as he approached her with a measured but purposeful stride. His eyes, normally calm and observant, held a flicker of concern. "Miss Justice," he said, his voice low but firm, "a moment of your time, if you would." Amara nodded, stepping to the side with him. Bartlett glanced over his shoulder, ensuring no one else was within earshot, before speaking again. "I'll be candid," he began. "What happened here today was unacceptable. Monroe's behavior was not only inappropriate but dangerous. I intend to address it formally." Amara studied him, her sharp mind working quickly to read between the lines. Bartlett's tone was sincere, but there was something else, a hesitation, a wariness. "I appreciate your concern, Your Honor," she said carefully. "But I get the sense there's more you want to say." Bartlett sighed, a faint crease forming between his brows. "You're perceptive, just like your father." "Yes, there is more. Monroe isn't acting in a vacuum. His attitude's his. Biases are part of a larger problem within this courthouse, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but it's a problem we've been far too slow to confront." Amara's expression didn't change, but inside, a spark of anger ignited. It wasn't new information. She had spent her entire life seeing how systemic injustice seeped into every level of power. Still, hearing it acknowledged by someone like Bartlett carried weight. Acknowledging the problem is a start, she said evenly. But what matters is how you address it. Bartlett nodded, his gaze steady. You're right, and I intend to start with Monroe. But he hesitated, his voice lowering. You should know that this won't be an easy fight. Monroe has allies, people who share his worldview. Pushing back against him will ruffle feathers, to say the least. Amara's jaw tightened. Ruffling feathers doesn't bother me, Your Honor. In fact, I welcome it. Bartlett allowed himself a faint smile, but his expression quickly sobered. Be careful, Miss Justice. Monroe won't take this lightly. Men like him rarely do. Amara inclined her head in acknowledgement. Thank you for the warning, Your Honor. But I assure you, I'm more than prepared. Bartlett gave a small nod and turned to leave, but not before adding, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out. Your father would expect nothing less. With that, he disappeared down the corridor, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Bartlett's words were well-intentioned, but they only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't here to make friends or tread lightly. She was here to hold people accountable, and she had no intention of backing down. Amara pushed open the doors to the courtroom, re-entering the space with the same quiet authority she had carried before. The gallery was alive with murmurs, people exchanging whispers about what had just transpired. The plaintiff's lawyers glanced at her as she walked past, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. The corporate defense team, however, barely looked her way, their focus firmly on their own notes and strategies. She took her seat in the back row once again, her movements calm and deliberate. The prosecutor, who had been watching her earlier, caught her eye and gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Amara returned the gesture, her expression unreadable. The trial resumed, and the tension in the room was palpable. Witnesses were called to the stand, their testimonies painting a damning picture of the corporation's exploitative practices. One worker, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a weary demeanor, described the unsafe conditions he had endured for years. His voice trembled as he recounted an incident where a colleague had been seriously injured due to faulty equipment, a preventable tragedy that the company had swept under the rug. Amara listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across the pages of her notebook. Each word, each detail, was meticulously recorded. But as she wrote, she could feel a presence nearby, a lingering weight of scrutiny that hadn't been there before. She glanced to her left and saw Monroe standing near the courtroom entrance, his eyes locked on her. His expression was a mask of controlled fury, his posture rigid and tense. He was no longer acting out of impulsive arrogance. This was something deeper, something more calculated. Amara met his gaze without flinching, her calm demeanor serving as a shield against his attempts to intimidate her. As the trial continued, Monroe remained rooted in place, his eyes never leaving her. Amara knew what he was doing. He was trying to reassert his dominance, to remind her that he still held some semblance of power. But she also knew that his presence here was a sign of his own insecurity. He wasn't watching her to intimidate her, he was watching because he was afraid. The prosecution rested its case, and the defense began its cross-examinations. The lead defense attorney, with his shark-like smile, was skilled at twisting words and deflecting blame. He painted the plaintiffs as opportunists, accusing them of exaggerating their claims for financial gain. It was a familiar strategy, one designed to sow doubt and undermine credibility. Amara's pen moved faster, her notes growing more detailed. She could see the cracks in the defense's arguments, the subtle inconsistencies that betrayed their attempts at manipulation. She wasn't just observing, she was preparing. This trial wasn't just about the plaintiffs or the corporation. It was about something far bigger. And Amara intended to make sure it ended on the right side of history. When the session adjourned for lunch, the gallery began to empty, the buzz of conversation filling the air. Amara remained seated, reviewing her notes as the crowd thinned. She was aware of Monroe approaching before she even looked up. His heavy boots and deliberate stride were hard to miss. He stopped beside her, his shadow falling across her notebook. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice low and edged with sarcasm. Amara didn't look up. "Quite," she replied, her tone neutral. "It's a fascinating case." Monroe's jaw tightened. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice dropping to a near growl, walking back in here like nothing happened. Amara finally lifted her gaze to meet his. "I'm here to observe a trial, Officer Monroe. That's all. If you're having trouble accepting that, I suggest you take it up with Judge Bartlett." Monroe's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You don't get to play the victim here," he snapped. "You think just because of who your father is you can waltz in here and—" "That's enough," a voice interrupted sharply. Both Amara and Monroe turned to see Jason Harper standing a few feet away, his expression firm. "Officer Monroe," Harper continued, "the court administrator has requested your presence in their office. Immediately." "Hi." Monroe glared at him, his frustration evident. "I'm busy," he muttered. "No, you're not," Harper replied, his tone unwavering. "They were very specific. You're to go now." Monroe's eyes flicked back to Amara, his gaze smoldering with resentment. But he knew he had no choice. With a final, sharp glare, he turned and stalked out of the courtroom. Amara watched him go, her expression unreadable. Harper approached her cautiously, his voice low. "I hope I didn't overstep." "You didn't," Amara said simply, her eyes still on the door Monroe had disappeared through. "But don't let your guard down. This isn't over." The courtroom had regained its rhythm after the lunch recess, but the air was charged with tension. Amara Justice sat in her seat in the gallery, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her notebook. From an outside perspective, she appeared calm, detached even, as though the earlier incident with Officer Monroe had been a minor inconvenience. But inside, she was processing every word, every action, and every detail, preparing for what she knew would come next. Men like Monroe didn't back down, especially when their authority was challenged, and she wasn't one to shy away from a fight. The trial resumed, with the defense calling its first witness a senior executive from the corporation being sued. Dressed in an expensive suit that seemed deliberately tailored to exude power, the man took the stand with an air of arrogance. His testimony was smooth, polished, and devoid of any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. As the defense attorney guided him through a series of carefully crafted questions, he painted a picture of a benevolent company unfairly targeted by disgruntled employees. Amara's pen flew across her notebook as she dissected his words. She noted the contradictions, the evasions, the subtle shifts in tone when pressed on certain details. This wasn't just a trial, it was a battle for narrative control. And while the courtroom focused on the witness, Amara was keenly aware of a different battle brewing just outside its walls. It started with a ripple, a faint disturbance that slowly grew louder. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a figure stepped inside. It was Officer Monroe. His return wasn't subtle, it was calculated. He strode in with an air of defiance, his boots thudding against the polished floor. His expression hardened into a mask of simmering anger. Amara felt his presence before she saw him. She didn't turn her head, didn't acknowledge him, but she knew he was there. Monroe's gaze locked onto her like a predator sizing up its prey. He lingered near the back of the room, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. It was a clear display of intimidation, a silent reminder that he wasn't finished with her. The courtroom proceedings continued, oblivious to the silent standoff taking place in the gallery. But for Amara, every fiber of her being was attuned to Monroe's movements. She knew this wasn't over. Men like Monroe didn't let things go, they escalated. As the defense wrapped up its questioning, the judge called for another brief recess. The gallery began to empty, and the hume of murmured conversations filled the room. Amara remained seated, her eyes scanning her notes, her pen moving with deliberate precision. She didn't have to look up to know that Monroe was making his way toward her. "Miss Justice," his voice came, low and mocking. "Still pretending like you belong here." Amara closed her notebook slowly, placing it on her lap before finally lifting her gaze to meet his. "Officer Monroe," she said evenly. "I thought you'd been summoned to the administrator's office. Did you decide not to go?" His jaw tightened at her calm tone. "I went," he said, "but don't think for a second that it changes anything. You're still out of line." "Out of line," Amara repeated, her tone mild but sharp. "Enlighten me, officer. What exactly have I done that's out of line?" Monroe leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You think you can come in here, throw your weight around, and embarrass me? I don't care who your father is. In this courthouse, you don't have special privileges." Amara's eyes didn't waver. "And I don't need them," she said calmly. "I'm here as a citizen, observing a public trial. If you're incapable of handling that, perhaps you're in the wrong line of work." Monroe's face darkened, his frustration boiling over. He straightened, his voice rising slightly. "Watch your mouth," he snapped. "I'm warning you." A few heads turned in their direction, curious onlookers sensing the rising tension. Amara remained unflinching, her gaze steady. "Are you warning me, Officer Monroe? Or are you threatening me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment Monroe seemed caught off guard. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The words were sharp, authoritative, and unmistakable. Both Amara and Monroe turned to see Judge Bartlett standing in the doorway, his expression thunderous. The room fell silent as the judge strode toward them, his robes billowing behind him. "Officer Monroe," Bartlett said, his tone icy, "I thought I made myself clear earlier. Your behavior is unacceptable, and I will not tolerate further disruptions in my courtroom." Monroe stiffened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Your Honor, I was just—" "You were just ignoring a direct order," Bartlett interrupted, his voice cutting through Monroe's protest. "Leave this courtroom immediately. And don't come back until I've spoken with the court administrator." Monroe's face flushed with anger, but he didn't dare argue further. With a final seething glare at Amara, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, the doors slamming shut behind him. The judge turned to Amara, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Justice, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. "Thank you." Bartlett nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "I'll ensure this matter is addressed properly. You have my word." Amara inclined her head. "I appreciate that, Your Honor." With that, Bartlett returned to the bench, and the courtroom slowly began to fill again as the trial resumed. But even as the proceedings continued, Amara could feel the tension lingering in the air. Monroe was gone for now, but she knew this wasn't the end. He would escalate further. Men like him always did. The trial proceeded with mounting intensity. The defense struggled to maintain its narrative as the prosecution methodically dismantled their arguments. Witness after witness painted a damning picture of corporate greed and exploitation, their testimonies underscoring the human cost of unchecked power. Amara's notes grew more detailed, her pen moving swiftly as she documented every key moment. But her focus wasn't solely on the trial. In the back of her mind, she was preparing for what she knew was coming. Monroe wasn't the type to let things go quietly. He would make his next move, and she intended to be ready. Her instincts proved correct. During the next recess, as she stepped into the hallway to stretch her legs, she spotted Monroe lingering near the far end of the corridor. He was speaking with another officer, his body language tense and agitated. Amara's presence didn't go unnoticed. Monroe's eyes flicked toward her, and his expression twisted into something darker. Amara held his gaze for a moment before turning away, her posture calm and unbothered. But inside she was calculating. Monroe's persistence was more than just wounded pride, it was dangerous. And the only way to neutralize that danger was to confront it head-on. As the trial resumed, Amara returned to her seat, her composure unshaken. But her mind was already working, formulating a strategy. Monroe thought he could intimidate her, silence her, make her regret standing up to him. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. And he was about to find out. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom as Judge Bartlett called the trial to order after another brief recess. The tension that had been simmering all day was now palpable, thick in the air like an approaching storm. Amara Justice sat in her seat, her gaze unwavering as she observed the proceedings. The corporate defense team looked rattled, their confident facade beginning to crack under the weight of the prosecution's evidence. But for Amara, the real battle was no longer just about the trial, it was about the unchecked abuse of power she had witnessed firsthand, and she was about to make her next move. The defense had called their final witness, and the courtroom was hushed as the witness began their testimony. It was a desperate attempt to salvage their case, a senior HR executive testifying about the company's so-called commitment to safety and fairness. But the jury's faces betrayed their skepticism. The testimonies of injured workers and suppressed whistleblowers had painted too clear a picture to be erased by corporate spin. Amara's pen moved swiftly across her notebook as she recorded the details. She wasn't just documenting for herself, she was preparing. The systematic abuse of power on display in the trial mirrored the behavior she had experienced earlier with Officer Monroe. The parallels were undeniable, and the irony was not lost on her. As the testimony dragged on, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a tall, commanding figure entered. For a moment, the murmurs in the gallery paused as heads turned toward the newcomer. Amara didn't need to look to know who it was. The room seemed to shift with the weight of his presence. Justice Lionel Justice, her father. Dressed in his customary sharp suit, Lionel Justice exuded authority. His calm, deliberate movements carried the gravity of a man who had spent decades shaping the legal landscape of the country. He didn't walk into rooms, he owned them. His eyes scanned the courtroom briefly before landing on Amara. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before taking a seat near the back. Monroe had re-entered the courtroom shortly before Lionel's arrival. Positioned near the wall at the back of the room, Monroe's confident posture faltered as he noticed who had just walked in. His face flushed, and he shifted uneasily, no longer leaning against the wall with the same arrogance. Amara felt the energy in the room change, but she kept her focus on the trial. Her father's presence was unexpected, but it didn't distract her. If anything, it reinforced her resolve. She hadn't told him about what had happened, she didn't need to. Lionel Justice had an uncanny ability to sense when something was amiss, and his arrival spoke volumes. As the defense wrapped up their questioning, Judge Bartlett announced a brief recess before closing arguments. The courtroom began to empty once again, but Amara remained seated, flipping through her notes. She didn't miss the way Monroe lingered near the back, his gaze darting between her and her father. It wasn't long before Lionel rose from his seat and approached her. The gallery was nearly empty now, the hum of conversation fading into the background. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, his voice low but firm. "Amara." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Father, do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked, his tone even but with an unmistakable edge. Amara closed her notebook, placing it carefully on her lap. "It's being handled," she said simply. Lionel's brow furrowed slightly. "I didn't ask if it was being handled. I asked what happened." She hesitated for a moment, then relented. "Officer Monroe," she said, her voice steady. "He decided I didn't belong in the courtroom. He tried to remove me." Lionel's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "Did he now?" Amara nodded. "Judge Bartlett intervened, but Monroe's behavior has been persistent." Lionel's gaze shifted toward Monroe, who was now watching them from across the room. The officer's posture was rigid, his expression a mixture of defiance and unease. Lionel's voice dropped to a near growl. "Persistent, you say?" "Don't do anything," Amara said quickly, placing a hand on his arm. "This is my fight." Lionel studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he gave a small nod. "Very well," he said. "But know this, you're not alone in this fight." Amara nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "I know." As Lionel returned to his seat, Monroe finally mustered the courage to approach. He walked toward Amara with deliberate steps, his face set in a mask of forced confidence. When he stopped in front of her, she looked up, her expression calm but unyielding. "Miss Justice," he said, his voice tight. "I trust there won't be any further disruptions." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "That depends, Officer Monroe," she replied. "Will you be creating any?" His face darkened, but before he could respond, Lionel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I suggest you choose your next words carefully, officer." Monroe froze, his eyes darting to Lionel. The older man's expression was cold and unforgiving, his gaze boring into the officer with the weight of years of authority. Monroe swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. "I was just ensuring everything was in order," Monroe stammered, taking a step back. "Everything is in order," Lionel said sharply. "And I suggest you focus on your duties, officer, rather than harassing my daughter." Monroe nodded stiffly, his face pale. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his retreat far less confident than his approach. Amara watched him go, her expression unreadable. When she turned back to her father, he gave her a faint smile. "I hope you don't mind my involvement." She smiled back. "Not this time." The recess ended, and the courtroom filled once again. The trial concluded with powerful closing arguments from both sides, but Amara's focus was no longer on the case. She had won her battle not just against Monroe, but against the very system he represented. Her composure, her resolve, and her refusal to back down had been her weapons, and she had wielded them with precision. As the gavel struck one final time and the courtroom began to empty, Amara rose from her seat. Lionel was waiting for her at the back of the room. Together they walked out of the courthouse, the sun casting long shadows across the steps. The battle was over, but Amara knew the war for justice was far from won. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder as they reached the bottom of the steps. "You handled yourself well today," he said. "Your mother would be proud." Amara smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is just the beginning," she said. "There's still so much to do." Lionel nodded, his expression solemn. "Then let's get to work." Together they walked into the fading light, their resolve unshaken, their fight for justice just beginning. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the hum of the day's proceedings replaced by the soft shuffle of papers and the distant echo of footsteps in the corridors. Amara Justice stood near the gallery exit, watching as the plaintiffs' working-class men and women who had poured their hearts into the trial quietly gathered their belongings. Their faces were weary but hopeful, a reflection of the emotional weight of the case. For them, the trial was more than a fight for justice. It was a chance to be seen, to be heard in a system that so often ignored them. Amara closed her notebook and slipped it into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate. The trial had concluded, but her own battle with Officer Monroe lingered in her mind. His behavior had been more than a personal affront, it was a symptom of a system plagued by unchecked power and deep-seated bias. And while she had stood her ground today, she knew this was far from over. As she turned to leave, she noticed her father, Lionel Justice, waiting for her near the entrance. His presence was as commanding as ever, his sharp suit and dignified bearing a reminder of the weight he carried in the legal world. But there was something softer in his expression now, a quiet pride that he rarely showed. "Ready?" he asked as she approached. Amara nodded. "Almost," she replied. "I just need a moment." Lionel inclined his head, understanding her unspoken request. "I'll wait outside." As he exited the courtroom, Amara turned back toward the empty benches. She walked slowly down the aisle, her hand brushing lightly against the polished wood. This space, this institution, had always represented justice in theory, but today had revealed just how flawed it could be in practice. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she approached the bench where the plaintiffs had sat. "Miss Justice," a voice called softly from behind her. Amara turned to see one of the plaintiffs, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a lined face, standing hesitantly in the aisle. She recognized her as Maria Sanchez, one of the workers who had testified about the corporation's unsafe labor practices. Maria's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her nervousness evident. "Yes?" Amara said gently, stepping toward her. Maria hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know exactly who you are, but I saw how you stood up to that officer. It meant a lot to all of us. People like him, they make it hard for people like us to even come forward, let alone fight." Amara's heart clenched at the woman's words. "You're braver than you realize, Maria," she said softly. "What you did today testifying, standing up for your rights, that's courage. Don't let anyone take that from you." Maria nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's just so rare to see someone like you, someone who knows the system but still fights for people like us." Amara placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, her voice steady and firm. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, "and neither should you. Your voice matters, Maria. Don't let them silence it." Maria smiled faintly, a spark of hope lighting her expression. "Thank you," she whispered. As Maria turned to leave, Amara stood silently for a moment, her thoughts swirling. This was why she fought, not for recognition or accolades, but for the people who were too often overlooked and marginalized. The plaintiff's courage had reminded her of the stakes, of the responsibility she carried as someone who understood the system and could challenge it from within. When Amara stepped outside, the courthouse steps were bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Her father stood at the base of the stairs, his hands clasped behind his back as he waited patiently. He turned as she approached, his gaze softening slightly. "All set?" he asked. "For now," she replied. "But there's more to do." Lionel nodded, his expression contemplative. "There always is," he said. "But you handled yourself well today, Amara. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for something much bigger." Amara met his gaze, her voice steady. "I learned from the best." Lionel's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You've taken what I've taught you and gone beyond it," he said. "That's how it should be." They began walking down the courthouse steps together, their strides matching in quiet confidence. As they reached the bottom, a familiar figure stepped into their path: Jason Harper, the young security officer who had tried to intervene earlier. "Miss Justice," he said, his tone respectful but hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I admire how you handled everything today. Officer Monroe was out of line, and you stood your ground. Not everyone would have." Amara regarded him thoughtfully. "Thank you, Jason," she said. "But it's not just about standing your ground, it's about changing the ground we stand on. What Monroe did wasn't just about me. It's part of a much bigger problem. If you want to help, start by holding people like him accountable. Speak up when you see something wrong, even if it's hard." Jason nodded, his expression resolute. "I will," he said. "And if you ever need someone to back you up, you know where to find me." Amara smiled faintly. "I'll hold you to that." As Harper walked away, Lionel glanced at his daughter, his expression thoughtful. "You've already started making changes," he said. "Even in the smallest ways it matters." "It's a start," Amara replied. "But it's not enough." The next day, the fallout from Monroe's actions began to unfold. Judge Bartlett had filed a formal complaint against him, and the court administrator launched an internal investigation. Monroe was suspended pending the outcome, and whispers of his behavior spread through the courthouse. Other staff members began coming forward, sharing stories of his misconduct that had long gone unchecked. The system, slow and resistant as it was, had been forced to confront its own rot. Amara followed the developments closely but didn't allow herself to dwell on them. Her focus was on the larger fight. She spent the following weeks connecting with advocacy groups, amplifying the voices of workers like Maria Sanchez, and drafting proposals for systemic reforms within the judicial system. One evening, as she sat in her office surrounded by stacks of notes and legal documents, her father entered, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He placed one in front of her and settled into the chair across from her desk. "You're pushing yourself hard," he said, his tone both proud and concerned. "There's too much at stake not to," she replied, taking a sip of the coffee. Lionel regarded her for a moment before speaking. "You know, when I first became a judge, I thought I could change everything overnight. I thought if I made the right decisions, justice would follow automatically. It took me years to realize how deeply the system is entrenched and how much patience it takes to dismantle it." Amara nodded. "Patience isn't my strong suit," she admitted, "but I'm learning." Lionel smiled faintly. "Good, because change doesn't happen in a single moment, Amara. It's built over time, one fight at a time. What you did in that courtroom, what you're doing now, that's how it starts." Amara met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "Then I'll keep fighting," she said, "one battle at a time." Lionel raised his mug in a silent toast. "To justice," he said. "To justice," Amara echoed, her voice firm. As the evening deepened and the world outside their office grew quiet, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready. She had faced power, bias, and intimidation, and she had emerged unbroken. This was just the beginning, and she was only getting started.